All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Steve Brooks from the University of Akron Bliss Institute and have the honor of being the moderator for our panel today. We will begin by having our 4 papers, and after that we will have some time for answering your questions. You will notice that at the top of the screen you have a Q&A place where you can ask questions, and I'll be reminding you to include those as we go through the papers today. And as I say, the question and answer period will happen after we are done. So let us begin with our first paper by Henry Crossman and entitled From Tea Party to Trump Party. So let us begin.
All right, so I'm going to start to share my screen here for the slides. While that's coming up, and we're going to pray that the Teams works properly here. Okay, so it should be good now. All right, so my name is Henry Crossman. I graduated from William & Mary in 2019, and I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Ronald Rappaport, a mentor of mine, Professor Emeritus, and we have a paper entitled From Tea Party to Trump Party. And I want to start with a quote. Here it is. From Jenny Beth Martin, the Tea Party Patriot president at the 2016 CPAC conference. She said, "He doesn't love you, me, and he doesn't love the Tea Party. Donald Trump has no business thinking he's Tea Party, and every Tea Party person who truly loves the Constitution should take that into account when you're casting your vote." But Tea Party supporters and leaders played a major role in his administration: Mike Pompeo, Mark Meadows, Ben Carson, Rick Perry, Jeff Sessions. So we ask, was this transformation also occurring among the mass level of support from the Tea Party? Research question is between Trump's entering the race and the beginning of his presidency, how have Tea Party evaluations of him changed, and what is the basis of that change? And to answer this question, we use a panel survey conducted in 2015, right after Trump announced his candidacy, but before the Iowa caucus, and a 2017 survey right after he was inaugurated president. What we find is that Trump has played a transformational role in redirecting Tea Party priorities and positions in a relatively short period of time, just that 2 years. So our paper focuses on the change in Trump evaluations and shifting issue priorities among Tea Party members from traditional Tea Party views to Trump priorities. Just to level set a little bit, prior to the Iowa caucuses, Trump's net favorability placed him among the bottom of the 14 major candidates for the Republican nomination, with many saying that they could not support him. The shift in favorability towards Trump that we see in our survey, even among those who said they could never support him at all initially, is the largest shift among candidates, and has Trump approaching or surpassing some of the foundational Tea Party candidates like Cruz, Carson, and Paul. We also see a major shift in policy priorities from deficit to immigration, and a large shift in favorability towards Trump. Now, I've said all of that to you, but now I've got to prove it. So how do we go about doing this? We survey FreedomWorks supporters. Why FreedomWorks? It's by far the most dominant Tea Party group with nearly a 500,000 members, but it also has a significant influence on election outcomes. You'll see here that an endorsement from FreedomWorks is worth an increase in the Republican vote of 2%, which when you're talking about the nomination process is pretty significant. In terms of conducting the survey, we base our analysis on a panel of about 900 FreedomWorks members that completed both the 2015 and 2017 surveys. In the appendix of the paper, we go into some more detail on the panel and all of that if you have any questions about that. So moving into the fun stuff, this is our first figure. On the x-axis, it has percent picking the candidate as the first choice for the nomination. On the y-axis, the percent unable to support. This is in 2015. Now, as you'll see, the establishment Republican candidates anchor the unable to support with Bush and Christie, and Cruz is anchoring the first choice for nomination among Tea Party supporters. What we see here is that in general, the more support a candidate has, the fewer that can't support him. But Trump is different. You see here, he's not even on the line. Positive intensity towards Trump was accompanied by significant negative intensity as well. And this gives him a somewhat unique placement among nomination candidates. So we dive into this a little bit more. Looking at the major candidates for the nomination, you see there on the bottom, between 2015 and 2017, we see that Trump not only shows the largest shift in a positive direction, Trump being right here, but that by 2017, his net favorability, this green bar, has surpassed Carson and is right up there with Paul and Cruz, these establishment Tea Party candidates. This is true even among respondents who in 2015 said that they could never support him for the nomination, which, as we'll show, is about 30% of the sample. What this suggests, just to bring it back out, is that Tea Party supporters didn't simply settle for Trump during the primary process, but that during the campaign and into his presidency, they became enthusiastic about him. Naturally, then, we ask why. Why is there this large increase in Trump favorability? Was it changes in which factors had the strongest impact, things like ideology, or did the issue positions and priorities shift among Tea Party members to become more aligned as the Trump campaign gained momentum and gained steam? So these two different areas kind of direct the rest of the paper. So now I'll turn to numbers because you can't go through a presentation without some numbers. So I've highlighted here the most important things to focus on. But we compare 2015 Tea Party evaluations of Cruz as a candidate against Trump evaluations in 2015. We choose Cruz because he's a favorite of the Tea Party. As you remember in the earlier graph, Cruz is anchoring that Tea Party support for the first choice for the nomination. And so we compare Cruz evaluations to Trump evaluations. We also expect that Cruz and Trump have different constituencies in the 2015 part of the survey here, and that we should find the same variables, ideology, immigration, deficit, having different effects on the evaluations of each. And as you can see in these highlighted sections, that is the case. Ideology has a clear, significant effect for Cruz, but no effect for Trump. Immigration has a strong effect for Trump, no effect for Cruz. And interestingly, cutting Social Security to balance the budget is significant for both, but in opposite directions. In 2017, I'll give it a second here to flip over. So in 2017, if we look at Trump evaluations, we see that these evaluations are looking significantly more like the 2015 evaluations of Cruz. Ideology and Tea Party evaluations have become significant in 2017, whereas remember they had no significance for Trump in 2015, and immigration is still important. And again, all the tables are in the paper as well. So what's driving this change? Why is Trump being evaluated more positively? First, we look at shifting issue priorities, those that are ranking different issues as their top priority into the election. As you see here, there's a lot of consistency between 2015 and 2017, but 2 of the 3 issues that have a more than 3% change are really important. They're of particular interest because they're so closely related to Trump's priorities, and that's immigration and the budget deficit. And as expected, these changes make our sample much more aligned with Trump's priorities. Most strikingly, you can see that between 2015 and 2017, the budget deficit became far less important to Tea Party activists, while immigration became much more important. While the budget deficit is a longstanding focus of the Tea Party, immigration really isn't. But you see that the debt, folks selecting debt as their top priority declines by more than half. Another interesting quote from Trump here. He says in 2016, "Debt was always sort of interesting to me. Now we're in a different situation with the country, but I would borrow knowing that if the economy crashed, you could make a deal. And if the economy was good, it was good. Therefore, you can't lose." And ignoring kind of the incoherence of the grammar there, it's clear that Trump's concept of the relative priority of the debt and the budget deficit is much different than Tea Party candidates prior to this point, which makes that decrease in the deficit much more interesting and tied to Trump. We also see that the emphasis on immigration is not a traditional Tea Party focus, and yet it's increasing in the percentage of respondents selecting it as a top priority. So after seeing this, we wanted to take a closer look at the mechanisms at play here in shifting priorities, and so we divided the sample into two groups. Those for whom Trump was their first choice for the nomination in 2015, and those who said that they could not support him. So we see that in Trump supporter and Trump rejector. And we look at these two key issues, the deficit as the top priority and the immigration as the top priority. And what we see is there's a big decrease in Tea Party members selecting the deficit as their top priority, and that there's a bigger increase among Trump rejectors. So it's Trump rejectors that are driving a lot of these outcomes. Because while it's not surprising that Trump priorities are more important for his supporters, that's something we expect when you support a candidate. What is surprising is that the shift towards Trump policies is evident even among those who initially said that they could not support him at all. Because this is the group that's least likely to be in line with Trump's policies, and particularly if those positions are contradicting earlier Tea Party views or are new issues altogether. So this shift towards Trump positions reveals just how powerful a force Trump has become in transforming Tea Party attitudes. So we've talked a lot about priorities, but it's also positions that shift. And I think that this is interesting as well. So we see here in Figure 6 the net support for reducing the deficit, even if it means cuts to Social Security or Medicare. And what we see is that Trump's issue positions again are becoming to be more favorably viewed by Tea Party supporters, even positions that contradict typical Tea Party views of wanting to cut the budget deficit. And so what we see is that among both Trump supporters and the Trump rejector group, the net support for reducing the deficit declines between 2015 and 2017, and that this movement is larger among Trump rejectors. So moving to the next phase, we asked, did positive Trump evaluations, meaning this increasing affinity for Trump, diminish or replace Tea Party evaluations? Essentially, did Trump replace the Tea Party? Interestingly, we find no, that Trump evaluations produced significantly higher Tea Party evaluations 2 years later. Table 3 here shows the two regressions that we ran. First here, second over here. The first model has just two predictors, Tea Party evaluation in 2015 and Trump evaluation in 2015. And in the second model, as controls, we've added evaluations of those typical Tea Party candidates like Cruz and Carson that again were anchoring that support for first choice among Tea Party supporters in 2015. The second model shows that neither Cruz nor Carson evaluations had the positive effect on Tea Party evaluations in 2017 that Trump evaluations did, even when you control for the Tea Party evaluations in 2015. There's a lot of numbers on that table. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is that the people who rated Trump highly demonstrated increased positive evaluations of the Tea Party, in 2017. And that's interesting because it suggests that the Tea Party-Trump relationship is not a substitution. People aren't leaving the Tea Party to go to Trump, rather that it's mutually reinforcing. And I think that has a lot of implications for how we understand the Tea Party moving forward.
3 more minutes.
That's perfect. So I'll wrap up here. But what we see is that in less than 2 years between announcing his candidacy and becoming president, Trump has moved from being a uniquely unpopular candidate for the Republican nomination among Tea Party supporters to becoming extraordinarily popular. Even those who rated him in the lowest categories and were unwilling to support him for the nomination in 2015 have come around to high levels of support by 2017 after he's inaugurated. Support for Trump, even among this resistant group of Tea Party supporters, these Trump rejectors, was more strongly related to issues not typically associated with, and sometimes in direct contrast to, earlier Tea Party positions, such as protecting Social Security, lack of concern about the deficit, and a high priority for immigration issues. And these are pretty significant shifts for Tea Party supporters. So concluding here, the sample that we surveyed shows a clear shift towards Trumpian positions over the 2-year period across a range of issues, and of particular note on the role of the deficit, the role of immigration. And in this way, a new form of Tea Party, a Trumpian Tea Party, has emerged between 2015 and 2017. So with that, I'll wrap up here, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially for being right on time. I have seen that we do not have any questions yet, but if this has prompted you to add them to the Q&A list, I encourage you to do so. And thank you very much. Our next panelist is Brian Conley, and his paper is entitled Democracy and Disinformation, Trump, the Republican Party, and the 2020 election.
Okay, I'm just trying to share here, and I ran into some technical difficulties. I'm not sure what happened. For some reason it minimized. Okay, hold on a second. Here it is. Okay, are you guys seeing anything? You're seeing a slide? Is it it says democracy and disinformation?
Yes.
Okay, it's interesting. It's funny. It does it so much different from how Zoom does it. It doesn't show it. Doesn't show it to me. Okay, well, my name is Brian Conley. I'm a professor in the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University in Boston. The title of this talk is Democracy and Disinformation, an analysis of Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. This is a chapter that I submitted and that was accepted to a forthcoming book on political marketing in the 2020 US presidential election. I'm a party scholar, but I've kind of gravitated a little bit into this political management, political marketing world because it provides a little more like analytical kind of meat on the bone, if you will, to some of the stuff, the traditional party literature in the United States. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to just quickly introduce some concepts. The research question, one of the core concepts I'm going to look at is populism, also this idea of a propaganda feedback loop. And then I'm going to get into some data with this case study example of Trump and Antifa. The article itself looked at both the issue of Antifa and socialism, but I'm just for purposes of keeping it short, I'm going to look just at Antifa. So again, I'm going to look at theoretical models, and then I'll get into some of the data. So, this is the thing about Trump, right? Highly unconventional behavior, violated all kinds of norms, like insults and innuendos against his opponents, demonized opponents, false claims, and even kind of challenged democracy. We may remember way before January 6th, back in 2016, when Trump was saying he might not accept the results of the election, even if he lost, right? So that's not new. And what happened in 2020 was terrible, but again, it was kind of forecasted in 2016. So kind of the question is impact. What's the impact on Trump? Well, it was negligible. If you look at the Gallup poll, for example, just one source, approval for Trump never dipped below 90% amongst Republicans during the election. So that was kind of intriguing. I have these questions about it, right? For me, it's about political strategy. What is the impact of the political strategy? What strategic things did he do that ensured such resilience? The presentation that Henry just gave was actually completely fascinating to me because you can look at how that issue shift is extraordinary amongst this very dedicated group of folks that were associated with the Tea Party. And that, it's just, we know, and in fact, that presentation really very succinctly describes the nightmare that was the reality for Ted Cruz, right? How could he possibly? It's totally inexplicable from his perspective that they would shift like that to a guy like Trump. So all kinds of, I have a strategic question, and then I also have a democracy question. So it's like, all these different strategies I'm going to look at. what's the impact on democracy, particularly the impact of disinformation, the use of disinformation. And just as a quick definition, disinformation is the intentional use of false information. It's not misinformation, right? Misinformation is like the unintentional use of false information. It could be a mistake. Disinformation is the intentional strategic use of false information. And then lastly, too, I tackle this concept of populism, because so much of what was at the core of Trump's claims related to concepts of populism. And so I kind of wanted to take that on. So a little more on some of the theoretical model here. So traditional populism, and I'd love to have, we'll debate results from this in the Q&A. Traditional populism was this idea that you had elites in the political system, typically more liberal, but not necessarily like democratic, who would mobilize public opinion or segments of the public voter base to target, elites in the economic system. So the traditional model of political populism was that you had elites organizing the public against other elites. So specifically, groups that had power organizing elements of the public against other groups that don't have power. So I developed this idea of inverted populism. Now, some people might say right-wing populism, but I actually think it's conceptually, it's better to call it inverted, because what we have here is in fact, I see this as liberal, but maybe I shouldn't keep that there. It's that some elements of the elites, economic elites, are mobilizing public opinion to rally their support, not against groups that have accumulated power, but against groups that have less power in society. So instead of mobilizing segments of the public to target groups, economic groups, particularly economic elites that have actually accumulated institutional power, what you're doing is you're mobilizing the public against groups that have less power. And that's where I got into looking at, well, I should say very quickly, we're looking at socialism and Antifa. But specifically, the other thing that's interesting about this is that this notion of inverted populism, what it does is it indirectly kind of props up the existing economics, the existing inequalities in the system. Because what you have then is you have elites mobilizing the public against groups that have less power. And in the process, that kind of implicitly, or not so implicitly through actual policy, affirms and supports those who have more power. So you're kind of flipping the traditional model of populism, where elites would organize elements of the public in order to check or counter other elites. So just a quick comment on the political marketing. Political marketing, as I said, is just this model of what's happening is that like marketing strategies that are being incorporated into politics, which myself, I have kind of a background working on political campaigns, and that's where I really noticed this. Campaigns have been basically taken over by marketing strategies for several decades now. Things like positioning and targeting and segmentation of voters. And then, so one of the questions that comes up a lot is political marketing and democracy. And interestingly enough, I think some of the questions that Trump raises about democracy are unrelated to political marketing here, because actually, what I would say very quickly, if you look at the democracy literature, there's a direct acknowledgement that yes, there's elections aim this direction, but institutional power is always top driven. So it's always an elite-led system. Democracy is an elite-led system, as democracy theory makes quite clear. So actually, but what the real takeaway here is that Trump's campaign is really a convergence of two emerging trends in U.S. politics: marketing and inverted populism. So going forward, so this, how does such a system work? Well, that's what I wanted to try to figure out and try to measure. And I think a key variable, as I mentioned before, is this use of disinformation. So so how does an inverted populist system work, where you mobilize segments of the public in order to target groups that have less power rather than groups that actually have institutional power? And that is through the use of disinformation. Specifically, I figured that you could measure this by looking at three variables. You could look at what Trump says, you can look at how it's picked up in the media, and then you can look at what effect it has on targeted voter segments. And I did that in the context of looking at two particular groups, Antifa and socialism, as I mentioned before. And what this does is I'm also using this model that was developed by Benkler et al. In the book called Network Propaganda. Benkler is based at the Harvard University's Center for the Internet and Society. And he develops this model called the propaganda feedback loop, which he describes as a largely closed self-referential feedback loop, where it is a system that rewards loyalty to a certain ideology and punishes those who deviate from that doctrine. More specifically, you can look at the different players here. Leaders, they seek favorable coverage from friendly media, and they punish media that deviate. The media itself provide favorable coverage to ideologically confirming leaders and punish leaders or other media who deviate from that ideology. Voters value ideologically confirming information or fact-checking and punish media or leaders that deviate from that ideology. So here's just another, kind of breakdown of it. Favor friendly media as opposed to critical media. The media itself in this system competes to deliver ideologically confirming information and punishes groups that deviate. And voters, again, look for favor ideology over fact and punish media or leaders that deviate. You can see, for example, in the treatment that Trump periodically gave to Fox, right? It was like he was policing Fox. When they would, for example, say that deliver the results that Arizona went for Biden, the perfect example of that, right? Both the viewers would punish media, Fox about that, but also publicly the leadership, i.e. Trump, would punish him. So in superimposing those ideas on this system here, what you have is you deliver ideology which is rewarded, so it's a feedback loop, and then if facts are essentially punished or discouraged. Now, how do I measure this? Well, what I wanted to do is look at this: messaging, media coverage, and the effect. And so the first part of it is to look at what we call the channels. It's the message structure. How does Trump develop? What channels did he look at? Did he use to develop his message? So what I did was I picked Twitter, I picked White House statements, I picked text messages, I picked emails and rallies. And I did this between May 25, 2020, so the day that George Floyd was killed, to the election. And specifically, the data included 49 tweets about Antifa, which, by the way, almost 60% of them are retweets. That's one of the things that's interesting about Trump is he retweets a lot, which is actually a key part of the feedback loop because he essentially is the amplifier. Not necessarily the originator per se, but the amplifier. And I will say that one of the key sources of information I got here was Trump's Twitter archive. So it's a website that catalogs all of Trump's tweets up until he was banned from Twitter. The White House statements, I looked at 23 over this period, referenced Antifa. Text messages, so I just signed up for text messages. I got, a lot of those. 8 of them referenced Antifa. Emails, 30 plus, and then just contents from rallies that were publicly available through YouTube. So just some of the examples of things that he stated, which, Antifa and the radical left is the problem. Don't blame others. Antifa is a radical left group that only wants bad things in the country. They're supported by fools. The other thing that was kind of interesting about it is that as you got closer, you can see that, this is like June, August, October. He started to more directly link Biden with Antifa. These are Biden fools, Antifa radicals, get them FBI. Here's some examples of the texts. Antifa wrecking our cities. It's Biden and Antifa versus Trump and America. I should go up to here and say, too, this one here, Biden and the Democrats hate America. September 10, Antifa thugs will ruin suburbs. Antifa alert, they will attack your homes if Joe's elected. So these were just, I looked at the messaging. So I was trying to look at like different channels that he was using. What was he saying? Next thing I shifted to was coverage. And I used a program which I would highly recommend called Media Cloud. Media Cloud is quite amazing. It allows you to search up to 100,000 sources over thousands of different media channels, all for free. It's public source. It's an open source. It's also supported by the Benkler Center at Harvard for the Internet and Society. So here, for example, I looked at what media sources were covering the topic of Antifa. This was an N of 40,000, a little over 40,000 sources. And partisanship here is they aggregate it based on Twitter shares. So you can look at, centrist media, what they refer to as the top mainstream media of 2018. This is just the most recent update database they had at the time. We can look at right-centered media, right-leaning media, centrist media, left media. So you can see here that 61% of the coverage of Antifa over that time period from May to November was on right-leaning news sources. And interestingly enough, you can actually look at the left. The left, Antifa is a self-identified left-leaning organization. It was only covered 11% of the time in right and left-leaning sources. If you look at Antifa and Trump, then we go up, 51%. But we can see, guys, this is a narrative that's primarily being carried by right-centered media. Here, the end is 26,000 stories. Sorry. The other thing I did here was I created a Gefi chart. This is, again, the sources here is 52,000 stories, 3,400 plus sources, and 16,000 plus media links. So these are retweets on Twitter, again, between May 25 and November 3rd, just about the word Antifa. And what you can see here is really quite extraordinary. You can see there are, as we already know, two media systems. But one thing I would come to mind here is that, like, in a minimum, we could have three, right? You could have left over here, you could have centrist, and you could have right. But actually what's happened is left to centrist media, so some sources which are quite far left, are really connected to mainstream media. They link into the New York Times, like things like The Nation, Vice, Vox, BuzzFeed, the Daily Beast, the ADL. They're all connected with CNN, Politico, NBC News, the AP. So the size of the node there indicates like how active it is. But what you have here is that you have a mainstream media that includes both the left and the right. And specifically what it's saying here is that they're linking to each other. 3 more minutes. Got it. Thanks a lot. On the opposite side, it's really quite fascinating. You see the example of what I was talking about, of the propaganda model. It's a self-referential system. There's almost no connection between conservative media and the mainstream media. One of the few nodes here that they do connect it to was the Justice Department, under Bill Barr, and the White House. So for example, like Fox News, the Daily Caller, Washington Examiner, Gateway Pundit, they are linking to the Justice Department. They are linking to the White House because it was Trump's White House. But otherwise, there's virtually very limited connection between the mainstream media and the right. And that's not the same on the left. The left is connected and integrated into the mainstream media. They quote from it, they cite it, they link their followers to it, but the right-wing media, conservative media, does not. So then I looked at the effect. So here, just taken from Pew data. So what do we have between September and June of last summer, 2020? We saw a 12% drop overall in support for Antifa, 15% amongst whites, 21% amongst Republicans, 4% amongst Democrats. So I was just kind of looking at like what's the effect of Trump's messaging and the fact that it was broadly embraced, virtually 60% of the coverage that it was getting from conservative media. What impact was that having on public opinion? And this was essentially the last slide here. We have these drops over time between June and September, and then lastly, which is quite extraordinary, is this one about Antifa from the Roper. 72% of Americans have either heard a little or a lot about Antifa. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I've been a person who's been studying social movements since I was about 12. I didn't hear about Antifa until a few years ago. Antifa is an extremely small, very, very marginal group within an extremely marginal social movement. So the fact that 72% of the public is aware of Antifa is absolutely extraordinary. And I'll end there and look forward to whatever comments people have. Okay, I think I stopped sharing.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Again, remind folks, if you have some questions that this presentation has developed, please post them in the proper place. Our next paper is by Peter Francia, and the paper is titled "The Divided Republicans: How the Paranoid Style is Reshaping Party Politics." Thank you.
Okay. See if I can pull that up. Can you see that?
Oh. Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the title of the paper again, "The Divided Republicans: How the Paranoid Style is Reshaping Party Politics." I added a co-author to this piece, Brittany Meyer. She's a PhD student in the Department of Psychology and a graduate assistant at the ECU Center for Survey Research, which I direct. So an additional author has been added. Brittany did a lot of work on this research and warranted more than just the usual thank you for assistance. She did enough, in my opinion, to earn co-authorship. So we have a co-author, but I will present for both today. Before I go through some of the terminology here, I also wanted to mention, and I hope this doesn't happen, but I am doing this presentation from home, and I have a German Shepherd puppy, about a year old. And so if there's any if you hear a dog barking in the background, I apologize. He's being very good right now, so let's hope it stays that way. And I also want to thank the Bliss Institute. Very just quick mention. This is 20 years ago. I came to the State of the Parties conference for the first time as a presenter. So it's really special to be back 20 years later. This is my 4th State of the Parties conference. So I want to thank everybody at the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics for inviting me to do yet another presentation. All right, so let's get into this talk. I wanted to go through some of the terminology and some previous research. We're talking about divisions within the Republican Party, but some of the terminology that you'll see in the literature, it may not use the word divided or division. It may be parties within parties, intra-party cleavages, diverse coalitions, factions might be another one that we think about. All of those terms are fine, and I'm going to use the word divisions again, but again, there's different ways of describing what I'm going to talk about today. Additional work on this topic, William Mayer's book, The Divided Democrats, talks about divisions, intra-party divisions within the Democratic Party. 2 decades later or so, in the 2010s, the discussion shifts a little bit from divided Democrats into divisions in the Republican Party. Ronald Rappaport in 2013 talked about Republican factionalism at the State of the Parties conference, which I attended. Also at that conference, Jonathan Morris and I, my co-author and a colleague of mine at East Carolina University, we wrote about divided Republicans, and that work was published in the 7th edition of the State of the Parties book. So today's talk, in a way, is an extension of some of the work that I started about divided Republicans at the State of the Parties conference way back in 2013. Although this presentation has a bit of a different spin on it, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. The Republican Party today, when I was writing at the 8 years ago, we were talking about the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement has faded, certainly relative to where it was 8 years ago, but there are divisions that have resurfaced in the Republican Party. And one of those divisions that's become front and center, certainly today and has been certainly since the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, is a divide between those in the Republican Party who are the most fiercely loyal to Donald Trump and specifically his claims of election fraud in the 2020 election. So some evidence to demonstrate that Republicans are indeed divided on election fraud claims, and this partly motivated my interest in this research today. In May of 2021, a Reuters Ipsos poll showed that 53% of Republicans believe that Donald Trump was the rightful winner of the 2020 presidential election and that his defeat was due to illegal voting. 47% answered that Joe Biden was the true president. That's a pretty even split among Republicans about the nature of election fraud and it costing Donald Trump, but at least almost more than half of Republicans believe that Donald Trump again was the rightful winner and that illegal voting cost him a rightful victory. So that split in opinion highlights at least some continuing divisions in the Republican Party. That leads to the question that Brittany and I started talking about and thinking about, and that was, why is it then that some Republicans believe that election fraud claims are real, and why is it that some Republicans don't believe those claims? We also thought, well, you could extend that question really to anybody. Why would anyone believe that, including independents and Democrats alike? So our research does extend beyond just Republicans in answering that larger question. But again, since Republicans are the most divided on the question, our specific focus is on those Republican divisions. But I think our findings, as you'll see, have implications beyond just Republicans. So what are we talking about with election fraud claims? Well, one, as an example, and I'm sure everybody here heard this and remembers it, but the claim that Dominion voting machines were deleting votes for Donald Trump or switching Trump votes to Joe Biden. And that was one of several, and I'll go through in this presentation a few others that we looked at in a survey that we did at the Center for Survey Research at East Carolina University. So misinformation and disinformation and belief in conspiracy theories, not new to American politics. In 1964, Richard Hofstadter wrote the famous essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, that was published in Harper's Magazine, later appeared as a book. in 1965. And Hofstadter observes early in the version of the book that Americans since the founding of the Republic have been prone to believing bizarre, irrational fantasies that, in his words, evoke a, quote, sense of heated exaggeration and suspiciousness. Now, I think, and my co-author and I think that Hofstadter's ideas about paranoia are interesting in today's landscape, where misinformation and disinformation, false information can be spread easily through electronic means, through social media, and through the internet. So in today's environment, it seems maybe revisiting Hofstadter's work is relevant. But it's important to remember Hofstadter was a historian, and his work is mostly is qualitative in nature. It's not quantitative. And Brittany and I, as quantitative researchers, wanted to take a quantitative look at the paranoid style. So Brittany, being the psychologist and who knows a little more than I do about the psychology of paranoid thought, said that one way to do this and to get at a close measure, at least in concept, of what Hofstadter talks about, is the revised green paranoid thought scale, or the R-GPTS. Just to give you a sense of the scale that's developed, the survey items from that paranoid thought scale, one that we picked out of the 8, just to give you an example, the statement, "People definitely laughed at me behind my back." And then responses range from 0, not at all, to 4, totally, being the case. And so with 8 sample items and a 0 to 4, 8 times 4, you can get as high as 32 on this scale. And of course, if everybody answers, if you answer 0 on all 8, you would be at 0. So it's a 0 to 32 scale to develop, to measure paranoia. I want to be clear, when we're talking about paranoia, we're not talking about it in a clinical sense. Like Hofstadter, we're talking about modes of expression by more or less normal people. Those are his words, characterized by ideas of reference, and those are Freeman's words in 2005 to talk about paranoia. More specifically, paranoia describes a persistent and increasingly severe feelings a person has that they are the target of intentional harm, regardless of the evidence. Paranoia and conspiratorial beliefs, though, are not one and the same. I had a colleague, a friend of mine, Jay Morris, who I presented with again 8 years ago, was telling him about this work, and he said, well, what's the difference between paranoia and believing in conspiracy? Aren't they sort of one and the same? And the psychology literature says no, that those two concepts are distinct from one another. And the psychology literature describes paranoia as the presumption that others have negative intentions towards oneself. Conspiracy theories are about important events that involve secret plots by the powerful to cover up the truth. So those are distinct concepts. They may be related, and in fact, the research from Imhoff and Lamberty found that indeed paranoia was a contributing factor to believing in conspiracy theories. So based on that work, we felt that there was some theoretical support then for testing paranoia in a political context. And specifically, since Republicans are divided on claims of election fraud, we thought it made sense to look at whether this psychological measure that's used in the psychology literature, what happens if we pull it over into the political science literature and ask a very specific question about whether paranoia has any influence on belief in election fraud? Because after all, many of the claims about election fraud are rooted in misinformation and disinformation. So, and again, more specifically, does it drive and does it help explain some of those Republican divisions that I started with? The dependent variable in our analysis is an election fraud scale. And we asked in our survey 4 items that were widely distributed on Twitter and on social media. Claim 1 was that there's evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. 2, that Republican poll watchers and observers in some states are not allowed to be present in vote counting rooms. 3, there's evidence of dead people who cast fraudulent ballots in some states. And 4, voting systems in some states switch votes from Trump to Biden. So those were 4 widely distributed claims. In fact, President Trump on Twitter at some point made reference to all 4 of those. So we chose those as 4 to look at and created a scale from 0 to 12 based on those 4 items. We ran reliability tests on all of our scales, and the Cronbach alpha numbers were above 0.9, so we had good validity in our scales. The data that we use, it's an original survey. We did it. I didn't get IRB approval until very recently, so we had to work really quickly. This was a survey done in October of 2021 through the ECU Center for Survey Research. It's a general population survey of adult nationwide. However, for our analysis in this paper, we looked at only people who voted in the 2020 election. The respondents completed the survey online, and we recruited respondents through through Lucid. And Lucid is a survey marketplace provider that recruits respondents from over 250 different sample suppliers. We paid respondents $1.50 to complete the survey, and the survey itself took less than 10 minutes to complete.
3 minutes.
How much?
3.
3. Okay. I'm going to fast forward. We have basically sample demographics that fit. I want to make sure that we get to the results. Party ID, by the way, is coded so that leaners are considered Republican leaners who are independents or Republicans. Democratic leaners are Democrats. Independents are those who lean towards neither party. We did some descriptive analysis here that showed essentially, again, even in our sample, Republicans are more divided than Democrats. But I want to get to the regression results before I finish up. Quick point, paranoia does not, Republicans, Democrats, and independents generally are about equal on the paranoia scale. So we're not suggesting here that Republicans are any more paranoid than Democrats or independents. There's the distribution. And this is the regression analysis, and this is the most important part of the paper. When we look at everybody, paranoia, even when you control for trust in media, party identification, and ideology, we see this strong relationship in influencing belief in election fraud. When we shifted the analysis from everybody to only Republicans, we again see a significant relationship for paranoia in increasing the likelihood of believing in election fraud. So in summary, Republicans are certainly currently divided on issues of election fraud. Paranoia can be found among all voters, regardless of party ID, but Republicans are the most likely to believe false information about election fraud. In attempting to explain Republican divisions on election fraud, paranoia stands out as a statistically significant factor, even when we control for other factors. Just to conclude, final slide here, we want to be clear, paranoia, again, is not exclusive to only Republicans. It comes across Democrats and independents. Previous research has suggested in other works that Democrats and independents can also fall victim to believing misinformation. But based on our work, we would encourage future research to look at paranoia on other issues that may affect Democrats and independents. On the issue of voting fraud, as we showed, that's the issue that divides Republicans. And if you want to understand why they're divided on that issue, at least our measure of paranoia had really strong statistical significance and strong explanatory power in understanding at least why voters are more likely to believe than others about debunked claims on election fraud. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Our last but not least paper is by Sarah Loving, entitled Riot in the Party, Voter Registration Following the January 6th, 2021 Capitol Insurrection.
Can you guys see and hear me and see my screen? Yes? Okay.
Yes,
Hi.
I can see it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the Bliss Institute and to everyone for being here today. My name is Sarah Loving, and I'm currently an undergraduate senior at the University of Florida studying political science and statistics. And this paper is part of my honors thesis, which is being advised by Dr. Dan Smith, who is here with me today. So our motivation for wanting to write this paper is, as many of you probably saw, in the weeks following the January 6, 2021 insurrection, multiple news outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, and the U.S. News and World Report reported that registered Republican voters were leaving the party in shocking numbers, with stories such as the New York Times ran a story with the headline, "There's nothing left, why thousands of voters are leaving the Republican Party." They used data from 25 states with voter registration and noted that 33,000 registered Republicans left the GOP in California, 12,000 in Pennsylvania, 10,000 in Arizona, and that overall over 140,000 Republicans left the party in the 25 states that they examined. And while these raw numbers are pretty shocking, we wanted to place these party switchers into context to see if these magnitudes are really as large as these news outlets claim, or if this is a common thing in years after elections. So we drew on multiple years of over 14 million voter registration records in our state of Florida and turned a critical eye towards the presumed phenomenon of the post-riot party switching in early 2021, and specifically the mass exodus of the Republican Party. So beginning this paper, we had 3 goals in mind. We wanted to investigate whether there were similar outmigrations of voters registered as Democrats, no party affiliates, and minor or third parties. We wanted to investigate to which parties these individuals were switching to, and we wanted to investigate whether there was similar party switching in early 2017 following the 2016 presidential election. So in short, we were interested in not only who exited the Republican Party, but also where did they go? Were these patterns different than in previous post-election years? And was the party switching isolated to just the Republican Party members? So prior to our main analysis, we wanted to highlight why the state of Florida provides us with a good case study for these rioters, as well as for support for Trump and the Republican Party more generally. So while Trump lost the national popular vote by about 7 million votes, he won the state of Florida by over 300,000 votes, which is a pretty big margin for a state with 14 million registered voters. And so these photos also show some Republicans from Florida at the rallies. And as of late October 2021, according to the FBI database of these rioters, about 10% of the nearly 700 individuals facing charges in the events were from Florida. I think 71 have been arrested who are from Florida out of the 700. And Florida is the most represented state at the riots. So this table shows the distribution of the rioters' characteristics compared with the distribution of all registered voters in Florida. So as you can see, nearly all of the rioters were white male Republicans, with these respective numbers being 86%, 83%, and 88%. And in all of these areas, these numbers far exceed the statewide total, with the rioters being 25% more white, 38% more male, and 52% more Republican. The rioters were also more likely to be middle-aged, with 30 to 44 being the most represented age group at 45.5%, exceeding the statewide rate by 22.7%. And this likely comes from the fact that only 6% of the rioters were over the age of 65. And finally, we also wanted to look at the turnout of these rioters. And they were far more likely to turn out to vote than the rest of Florida. And we conditioned on whether the rioters or these voters were in the voter file at the time of the election that we were looking at. And the turnout numbers for the rioters are actually quite staggering. Surprisingly, the largest difference in turnout came in the 2018 election, with rioters 21.8%, higher turnout rate than the rest of Florida. And this was an election in which Trump was not even on the ballot. And as can be seen in this differences column, turnout always exceeded 10% when the rioters, or measuring the rioters versus the rest of the state. So we also wanted to condition to just look at Republicans, since in the 2020 primary, obviously people registered who no party cannot vote in Florida, since we have closed primary system. And when conditioning for only Republican rioters who were in the voter file in time to vote in the 2020 general election, each and every one of them turned out to vote, and their turnout numbers still exceeded the rest of the Republicans in Florida. So this contradicts reports by some media outlets that the rioters were not Republican loyalists, but rather Trump loyalists, because they turned out to vote even when Trump wasn't on the ballot. So these people definitely identified and turned out to vote for the Republican Party. So now we wanted to examine, did other registered Republicans in Florida who were aware of the participants on January 6th respond to the riots by defecting from the GOP? And now Professor Smith is going to.
All right, we're going to do a do-si-do here. Thank you, Sarah. Good to see everyone. Sorry, we're not in Akron. This is kind of the motivation, as Sarah said, and we're trying to think about the stickiness of party identification. I don't need to educate any of you on this whole literature, and so I'm going to go fairly quickly through it. There's very little out there, in fact, in terms of the motivations of why people would switch parties. There's a lot on switching and defecting in terms of vote choice, but in terms of leaving the party, the American voter theorizes that it's these cataclysmic events that happen, and they point to just two, the Civil War and the Great Depression, in terms of why there was a mass defection from political parties. But really, there's very little, and that's because, with few exceptions, and they are important exceptions, but I think they help to explain these defections. Political identification for parties is really quite fixed. It's very sticky, and it's probably gotten stickier over time with respect to the party sorting that's been going on, this hostility towards parties, as Alan talked about yesterday, and intergroup alliances. So there's an expectation that there shouldn't be much defection, unless perhaps this social force on January 6th was akin to some type of cataclysmic event. I think it'd be hard to say that it's equivalent to the Civil War or the Great Depression, but certainly it had major impressions on folks. Of course, Mo Fiorina and others have talked about partisan identification as being this running tally and retrospective evaluations. Perhaps that helps to explain what the New York Times and others thought to be this mass exodus from the Republican Party. So we don't have a lot of heavy theory here. We're just trying to draw on some of this literature. Turning to that question of whether or not people actually do leave a political party, there's very little literature. Barry Burden and Stephen Green used data from now, is that 40 years ago, 30 some years ago, to look at defection, but with respect to vote choice for presidential candidates or Senate candidates. Matt Thornburg uses ANES, also looks at defection from political party in terms of registration, but there's really not a lot in terms of thinking about registrations. And just one more point is leaving your party in terms of changing your party in a state like Florida, where you have to join a party if you want to vote in a primary election, is a lot more difficult than telling the survey enumerator, yeah, I'm no longer a Republican, I'm a no party affiliate. That's a pretty easy response to make, as opposed to going through the motions of actually changing your registration. And it's actually a little harder now in Florida because of Senate Bill 90, which has been a little in the news, at least as a precipitator of some other events in the news. So what do? We draw on official voter files in Florida, several different snapshots, specifically 4 snapshots, a snapshot from January 1st, 2021, a snapshot from February 1st, 2021, and then also snapshots from January and February of 2017. We filter and condition effectively on people who are registered in that February snapshot. So we do lose some people who have left the party, left the state, have been purged, whatever. But we are consistent across both those years. And we're isolating party identification with respect to registration and whether or not individuals switch their party from time 1 to time 2. As Sarah mentioned, we're trying to gauge the magnitude, the direction of party switching, as well as comparing over time to see whether or not this was unusual, what the New York Times and others had picked up with respect to the mass defections that were being reported in the popular press. So just quickly, and I think it's pretty intuitive now of what we're expecting. We're expecting a higher rate of Republicans based on that mass coverage in the press in early 2021, February. We expect there was a greater hemorrhaging from Republicans than from Democrats in terms of the change of party registration. We expect the GOP rate from the GOP to the Democrat to be greater in 2021 than in 2017. We don't think it's going to be very great. We don't think it's big switches, even though we start off the paper with a couple of quotes of people leaving the Republican Party and switching to the Democratic Party. We actually don't think that that's very likely in terms of a party registration. And we think that it's generally going to be larger across the board in 2021 February as opposed to 2017 February. So I've got this table up here, and again, this is from the 15 million registered voters, because we look at active and inactive. There are about 14 million active registered voters, but it's important to look at inactive as well. As Sarah pointed out, the rioters, all, and specifically the 66 Republicans out of the 71, I think it was, are active voters. 100% turned out in the last election. So we'll talk about that in the conclusion. If you look at the bottom here, you can see that Republicans overall, it was less than 0.5% of all registered Republicans left the Republican Party in that month. Now, is that a huge defection? Is it a little defection? Well, it's, I guess, relative. And certainly you can look at, with respect to Democrats up top, it was, you know, almost 4 times as much as Democrats leaving the party in February compared to January. So again, there's something going on. Did they leave to the Democratic Party? You know, the top 3 figures over here, Democrat, MPA, and minor, add up to 45.45. No, they were not becoming Democrats. They, you know, became more likely NPAs, 3 times more likely than shifting to the Democratic Party. But there was some movement, and certainly relative to the Democratic switchers up top, where only 3/100ths of the switchers left the Democratic Party to become Republicans. If you compare it to 2017, and this is 2021 to 2017, you can see that the total switchers in 2017 after the election was only 0.05% compared to that 40.45%. So a 9-time higher rate of defection. And we don't see the same type of massive changes after the 2016 election of Democrats. Only 0.08% left the Democratic Party, and they split evenly between the NPAs and Republicans. All right, so the party defection in 2021 was real. It wasn't universal. Republicans certainly more likely than Democrats to be switching, although they didn't become registered as Democrats. They became more likely to be NPAs. And we don't see the same type of trend in 2017 across the board. Even among the losers, the Democrats did not defect from the party. So something is going on here. The voter file is wonderful in terms of we don't have to worry about any response bias. We know exactly what's going on. We know who these people are. We know their race and their gender, their age. We know their vote history. We know where they live. And this is just part of Sarah's thesis. She's going to be doing a lot more digging. But to conclude, I mean, I think first thing we're going to do, I suspect we could probably get this published in an op-ed somewhere, is doing a little op-ed about pushing back on the false flag. Certainly in Florida, these were not just, you know, Antifa. I don't even know how to say it, Brian. You know, it's, you know, not, you never heard of it. I guess still can't even say it. What the hell is this? But it's, you know, not a false flag. These were Republicans, and they were active Republicans. And I don't think that has been out there in the press yet, that who these individuals were. We know their demographics a little just from their profiles and from their arrests, but we don't know about their past vote history. So that's one thing that we're going to crank out pretty quickly, I think. These are diehard Republicans, generally. Is it the fall of the Republican Party on the flip side? Hard to say that less than 0.5% defection and going mostly to the NPAs is going to hamper the Republican Party. My money is on the Republican Party doing a clean sweep in 2018 across the board, statewide and House and Senate, congressional seats picked up. I don't think this is anything about mass defection from the masses of mainstream Republicans from the party thinking that they're going to go somewhere else because of the January 6th events. A lot of hyperbole, in other words, from a lot of the media coverage, which again was understandable. It was an insurrection. There's no question about it. But party identification and party registration is sticky. So again, would it have been less had Trump just walked off and said, "Yeah, I lost"? Yeah, probably. But as you can see, it's not really hurting the Republican Party in terms of ginning up the base. It's not having a massive defection of more reasonable, moderate, however you want to call them, Republicans. So our findings are actually somewhat supported. I don't think they're as dramatic as this working paper out there right now that's looking at Twitter and looking at people taking away various emojis, what are they called up there?
Hashtags.
And hashtags and things on the top of your Twitter feed, where they were taking away Trump's insignias and things after the insurrection. I don't think we're at that level, but again, that's a pretty low cost effort to change your partisan take. And then finally, just to plug Sarah, who is continuing her internship with the Brennan Center. She had that last summer, and it's a real honor to continue working with them this fall, and she's gonna be terrific, whatever she wants to do, if she wants to go into the private sector or continue into graduate school. But she's going to be running some difference in difference models, so we can actually control for all those other factors that we know, including place of residence. We're actually interested in whether or not the defection rates from party may have been higher in the places where some of the rioters lived, whether there was a backlash more locally. And the other thing that's, Peter was just talking about IRB. It's going to be fun to try to go through IRB because we want to be able to survey these individuals who have defected, but also take a random draw of people who didn't defect, and then also survey the people who have been arrested about why they may have left the party or not left the party. So I'll leave it at that. And again, taking a page out of Alan, I have no idea how this got on this slide deck. It's not the Atlanta Braves, but yeah, I'll let that sit there for a second. Andy Marette, who's with the Miami Herald, is actually a UF grad and is as sick as everyone else about what's going on here. So I'm gonna leave that there. My office is being bugged. I'm happy to turn the screen up there so that other folks can see it. Yeah, we appreciate all the support we've been giving. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now we will move to question and answer time. We've received some questions in the Q&A section, but we have plenty of time, so I encourage you to keep adding to those. And and what we'll do is I will just read the questions that have come in. Some of them are specific to papers, and then I think we might have a couple that we'll let anybody jump in if they would like. So let me, and we'll kind of do it in the order that at least one for each paper kind of thing. The first one says, fascinating paper. This is for Professor Crossman. Tea Party supporters clearly shifted their views in response to Trump's nomination. Is it not also the case that Trump shifted his views over time to bring them in line with the Tea Party on issues like government regulations and taxes? This alliance seems to have affected Trump as well as affecting the Tea Party. Professor. Professor Crossman? You're muted, Professor Crossman. Can you unmute?
Any chance it's working now?
Yeah, it is.
Very good.
Yes? Okay, great. So I've got some lag issues on my side, so everything's moving quite slow. Yeah, I think it's a fair question. Who's driving the change, right? Trump obviously wants to get elected. Is he going to shift his views to capture those votes? And I think that what we show, and I'll point to the two quotes that I emphasize because I think that they really show is that there's almost no interest. I shouldn't say almost no. Only 15% are selecting Trump as their first choice for the nomination, and double that, about 30 are saying they're never going to support him. That's a pretty strong claim that 30% are unwilling to support from the beginning. And he's staked pretty clear positions from the beginning. His really controversial remarks about immigration as he's announcing his campaign, to his kind of unwillingness to focus on the debt issue while promoting, saving Social Security, Medicare. And I don't think that he shifts tremendously on that. Where I think we see the shift is that decline in Tea Party members really caring about that as their top priority. And I will caveat that. It's not that Tea Party supporters have decided the deficit doesn't matter at all, spend as much money as you want, because that we just don't see that. But in terms of it being their number one, number two issue, that's where we see the decline. And I think that Trump's messaging around that kind of explains that. So hopefully that captures the question. The lag issues also prevent me from seeing the Q&A, but if others want to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to mention too, I'm having lag and glitching issues as well.
All right, thank you. Let me move to the next question for Professor Conley. Oops, I'm sorry. Yes, it says, Brian, when you mentioned targeting the less powerful, I thought you were referring to immigrants and people of color. So I'm curious why you selected Antifa and socialists.
That is a good question. And I'm trying to recall what my thinking was at the time. As is normally the case with a lot of, the methodological challenges of doing research, finding, the evidence. I think partly it was that I took these two, particularly Antifa, as a way that it's kind of like a coded way that Trump was criticizing BLM, Black Lives Matter. Because actually, my recollection from my preliminary stages of the research, I think indicated that, I'll give you an example. I wrote another paper, for example, looking at potentially the role of gender in a comparative analysis between Warren and Sanders in the Democratic primary, right? And what I found was like a studious attempt a studious attempt within the media, looking at aggregate kind of media references to avoid direct references to gender. And I think there was some of that as well in Trump. And then, so therefore, I found that there was available evidence looking at for these two targets of his, Antifa and socialism. So looking through the data on texting, on White House statements, on rallies, I found that these were two subjects that I could probably measure.
All right, thank you much. I have in here another question for Professor Crossman. What research, if any, are you planning on doing in the future with the Tea Party? Are there thoughts on maybe looking into what point President Biden's platform may have played a role for more Tea Party members to support Trump to try and keep the support Trump to keep the Republican Party unfractured for the 2020 election?
Hey, Stephen, this is Dan. I think he may have dropped off.
Oh, yes. Okay. I hope we can get him back. Let me go back to my trove of questions here. I'm going to try to try this one out for everyone. Kind of all these papers seem to be interested in some way or another about the Republican Party fracturing, or is it coming together, and all of that. I think those. I'm not a party scholar, but from my understanding, there is always a tension when we're looking at elections in terms of how much the policy positions that the candidates take influence voting versus other factors. And I guess my question would come in what you have seen. How much is winning more important than policy issues in terms of both campaigning and kind of keeping the party together?
I guess I'll make a quick comment. And actually, I think that Henry's too bad we lost Henry again. Like I had some glitching and I turned off the Q&A and it seemed to help. But I thought that his research on that question of who's moving, is it the voters or is it Trump? And the answer is probably that it's both. I mean, we do know from, for example, Josh Green's book, The Devil's Bargain, that kind of analyzed Trump's relationship with Steve Bannon, that Bannon was heavily influential on Trump in terms of nationalist politics. At least that's what Green argues, that that Trump wasn't as clearly kind of keyed in on those issues until he started, until he met Biden and Miller and a number of these other people that were influential in the early stages, and Roger Stone. Like, for example, if I recall correctly, at least one of the arguments that was made was that Stone and another early advisor had actually recommended to Trump to reference or talk about a wall, in a sense, just as to remind him to talk about immigration. Because in some of the rallies, he wouldn't mention immigration, he would forget, because he's just kind of ad-libbing things or off the cuff, whatever, not following a script. And then therefore, Stone and another advisor were like, mention a wall. And then that way you can remember the wall. It's kind of like a memory, device or whatever. And but I think that could be part of it. It was like that there's been this, that Trump was moving as well as the voters.
Stephen, I'll take a stab at the question. You had asked about policy versus winning. Is that how I understood it?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, when we see that these people changed their positions, was it because they wanted the person to win, not because they really had deep-seated policy reasons for voting or not voting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try not to take the. I don't want to sound as though I'm being overly cautious in my answer here, or trying to take both sides. But I think actually the answer is probably a little bit of both. We just had an election on Tuesday night, and at least some of the data that's coming out of states like Virginia, local issues about schools mattered. So I don't think we should undersell issues. However, I think we also know that voters are rational, and they do want to pick candidates that give their party the best chance to win. So I think it's a little bit of column A and column B in answering that question. With respect to some of the work that I did on election fraud, I think if we want to get into a little bit of a discussion about Republicans being divided, I would tell everybody, let's pay close attention to Republican primaries in the months to come. I believe that the election fraud question is going to be a very dividing issue among Republicans, and it's going to be looked at as a test of loyalty to Donald Trump. And I think in Republican primaries, we're going to see that issue come up. And so that's a little removed from the question you asked, but it does in some respects speak to, what voters are going to be thinking about in the months to come. So at least among Republicans in the primary, keep an eye on that issue because I don't think it's going away.
I think that's an interesting point. We'll see if there's any backlash towards these, whether they're conspiracy theories in which they haven't borne out in terms of the election fraud in places like Arizona, most notably. But we saw just yesterday Governor DeSantis rolling out his new 25-member election police that are going after the, 3 cases of voter fraud, as my colleague said. Sign up for that job. That's a lot of sitting on your ass all day. Yes, that would be Mike McDonald. And yeah, it sounds like a good gig because there's very little cases. And of course, Trump won easily, relatively speaking, in Florida. But he did it because Roger Stone said, oh, I may primary you in the Republican primary in 2022. So is that policy? Is that what Republicans are chomping at the bit to have here in Florida? There are some, but it's not generally speaking that. But it's good food and fodder to the base that believes that not enough is being done here, that these elections are too close, and people are voting who shouldn't be voting. And so again, I think it's a mix. In this case, this is an easy one, a straw man in some ways. This is not really policy. It came out of nowhere. It's very poorly written, and if he tries to implement it, there will be some pushback, I assume. But yeah, it's a good question, Stephen. It's one that is a perennial one, I think.
And I guess I just had one other quick comment on that. That's an interesting observation. The other thing I think about Trump, it's just, if you go back to 2016, again, some of what we understand is that, like, he gave that speech coming down the escalator to announce, and it was, it was very provocative, and it was really widely criticized in the media. But my understanding was at the time that the campaign had scheduled 1 or 2 rallies already, so they figured, well, let's just go ahead with the rallies, because I think a number of the people in the core group, were like, oh, we're kind of done. The media reaction was so negative to that announcement. But it turned out people showed up at the rallies, like large numbers of people. And so there was kind of this evolution in 2016, and you could see it by the summer of 2016 that, like, Kushner, his son-in-law, really started to push Trump into kind of more of a data-driven campaigning strategy. He had brought in some Wall Street people he knew or whatever. And then, that led to that data operation they had in San Antonio that was run by the gentleman named Brad Pascal, and also ultimately led to them hiring Cambridge Analytica, I think, by September. So, but the point was that even though Trump was very public about the idea that he doesn't follow polls and that he just kind of says what he wants to, there's a significant amount of evidence that he really started over the course of the 2016 election. Once people around him started to see that actually he might be viable, started winning primaries and stuff like that, that they started to do more systematic targeting of their messaging and message crafting.
I actually think that's a really good point, because if you dig into what Cambridge Analytica was doing, Miami Herald has a great story where they tied in, because they got this treasure trove leaked to them, and could see the type of message targeting that was about policy, specific policies, targeted very differently, different policies to different subgroups. Now, they didn't get it all right. They mistargeted quite a few people because they misclassified them, and that was some of the work that I did with the Miami Herald to actually match up the race and ethnicity of their imputed data that they had. So they may not have been meshing perfectly, but we saw that in terms of types of media that we don't normally focus on, things going through Snapchat and through various types of Signal, and what's the other one I'm blanking on? WhatsApp, using this type of messaging in the Hispanic community in South Florida. So again, the policy, sometimes it's easy to ignore policy because we don't always see it in terms of through the mainstream, but it is being micro-targeted in ways that, again, it's certainly with an edge, but it is talking about issues.
Yeah, and Dan, could you reference, what was it, the Herald that you cited?
Yeah, the Miami Herald had Sarah, what is Sarah's last name? Anyway, four reporters did a great job down in Miami Herald. It probably came out a little less than a year ago on looking at Cambridge Analytica. They got dumped all the micro level policy positions, that individual level data. And so we geocoded and matched up. And so they had about 2 or 3 different stories in there. And it's some of the best reporting I've seen on how that actually was utilized. Because I was a skeptic. I was, come on, give me a break. You're doing this incredible micro-targeting. But in general, they were pretty good. They had some real big misses. They had a lot of Hispanics being coded as Mexican in South Florida, which is just not the case. And they had a lot of people who were Puerto Rican born, because I have from the voter file, I know where people are born, and they thought they were Cuban, for instance. But they had some very strong messaging. So take a look at that. I'll see if I can dig it up and put it in the chat.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I'm gonna try to search for it. If I don't be surprised if I email you. I'm just curious. I'd love to find it. Yeah.
Kind of in this theme, I just have a new question. Does the shift in support for Trump and the very small number of Republicans defecting after January 6th indicate support for Hetherington's and Weller's claim that some Republicans have embraced an authoritarian worldview? Or is this simply stability of partisan identification and importance of elites in cue giving? And toss that open for any and all.
Well, I feel like I'm speaking too much, but there was a piece done by a grad student at UMass Amherst. I think his name was Mick Williams. And what I saw was, I think it was a Washington Post editorial. And then I ran into him at a conference. And what he did was he did a study, he did a survey of Trump supporters, and he asked them about their parenting philosophy. And I'm trying to remember exactly the methodologically, but he put it on like an authoritarian scale. It was like, do you value creativity over obedience and this kind of stuff? So there's been some research on that. I think that's pointed towards this idea that there's some an authoritarian personality scale, that there's been some correlation, at least, between Trump supporters and the authoritarian personality characteristics.
Again, I wrote a piece with Seth McKee and Trey Hood that came out in PS last year, that we did a module on the 2016 CCES, now the CES, in which we asked Herbert McCloskey's questions that he had asked in the 1950s. And, people should take a look at that, because this authoritarianism is certainly there. Racism is certainly there among certain groups as well, but it's pretty shocking to see those latent, if not fully expressed, positions that McCloskey was very concerned about back when he wrote this piece in 1964, I think it was. So take a look at it. It's up at PS, and again, it's not as in depth. That's why it's in PS, but I think it's indicative of what we're seeing still today.
All right, I have another one here. Again, any presenter wants. The Virginia governor's race may have been won by taking a Trump-supported but Trump-uninvolved strategy. If that becomes the standard strategy, what effect will that have on the Trump takeover?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that if Trump endorsed candidates win, that certainly allows Donald Trump to maintain an influence over the Republican Party. But I would add the caveat that the Virginia race is probably a roadmap that Republicans running in 2022 might be wise to follow. There was a lot of the Democrats really tried, especially actually in New Jersey. I think we bring New Jersey up as well. The governor in the state of New Jersey, a Democrat, really tried to paint his Republican opponent as Donald Trump light. And that strategy nearly backfired. The Republican candidate in that race kept the campaign focused on a lot of local issues. Tip O'Neill's old saying, well, politics is local. The Republicans who followed that strategy in Virginia and New Jersey did very, very well with it. And so I think it's likely that in 2022, we'll see a lot of Republicans running for Congress and Senate, try to emulate that strategy. But Donald Trump's going to be out there issuing his endorsements. And again, back to something I talked about earlier, take a look in the Republican primaries. That's where we really get into those Republican divisions. And that Trump endorsement is going to be important there. We'll get a good sense of Trump's grip on the party by looking at Republican primaries. But by the time we get to the general, I think then we shift to some of the things I just talked about.
I have received another one. Let me try to read it here. How will the usage of gaslighting and misinformation play a role in the 22 midterms and 24 presidential election? Anyone?
I mean, I guess my 2 cents would be, I think it's going to be, the issue of the number one thing that would come to mind for me is going to be voter fraud, allegations of voter fraud, and also the fact that states around the country are making it much more difficult to vote, right, in response to concerns about voter fraud. As Daniel said before, pretty much just don't exist. There's no evidence of coordinated voter fraud in the United States. I think that the two sources I would cite would be the FBI and the Cato Institute. I mean, Cato has an entire databases dedicated to finding voter fraud. If you look at them, it shows how uncommon it is. I mean, and there's virtually this. It just screams there's no coordinated evidence of voter fraud. But I think the fact that all these states have been passing these restrictions on voting, I mean, that's going to be unfortunately a game-changing variable in the midterm 22.
If I can jump in just by adding to the question and not so much answering it. Professor Conley, you mentioned Trump in his role of amplifier, not so much creating the disinformation, but amplifying it. I'm curious, once he's banned from Twitter, essentially, and loses that ability to amplify, how do you think that moving to Parler or Trump's own social media, I suspect he'll try to amplify there. Do you see it as having the same effect?
Yes. So I'm going to answer kind of in reverse. I think the short answer is no. And again, if you go back to the evolution of Trump as a political figure over the last 20 years or whatever, the fact that he got so much mainstream press was a key variable. And I think the thing is, if he does go to these smaller platforms, then he's going to, by definition, have less reach. And that's the thing. So Benkler, as I mentioned, the scholar who worked on that book, Network Propaganda, they make this argument that there's a group of scholars at the Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard, and they developed these two models. One of like a mass-based model of what's driving trolling and disinformation on the internet, and then the other one is an elite-led, and they basically fall on the elite-led side. And I think it's true. That's what they mean, and that's what I mean by the amplifier. They're saying that actually, you could have someone again in their basement writing something crazy about Hillary Clinton having certain illnesses. Well, that means nothing really until it gets amplified by someone like Trump. I mean, it's not going to go anywhere. So without Trump in the loop, you can have millions of these people doing these things, but they don't get much traction. So I think that's the elite-led model of amplification, and I think that actually Trump being off of these major platforms is really going to hurt him actually, because there's just not a lot of people by comparative numbers. It's just not nearly as many people who are either directly or indirectly exposed to Trump's ideas through like a Parler or whatever, as they would be through Facebook or Twitter.
So the question, kind of getting back to Peter's point too, and marrying these two two perspectives, is if he doesn't jump in, I suspect he won't, he doesn't want to lose, will it allow those other Republican candidates to speak more truth to Trump now that he doesn't have that same amplifying platform? I think that's an interesting question. And who will be the first Republican, folks who put their names in the hat, who will actually try to move away? We saw it try to happen with John Kasich last time around, and it didn't work out very well for him. But again, that's because Trump was there and could squash him with his social media and then the mainstream press. So I don't know. I'm not a presidential scholar. I don't follow those campaigns very closely. But I think Peter's point is a very good one, and Henry, and Brian's response, I think, are correct. And I think that's where we're going to see it, is in that presidential primary of whether or not the testing of his, taking the megaphone away is going to allow for a little more differentiation.
And I think I'd say too quickly, I mean, just given what we know about certain targeted voter groups, younger people, single women, people of color, and turnout rates in midterm elections, I mean, I'm very concerned about these barriers. I mean, I think it could be devastating. From a Democratic Party perspective, I think it's going to be devastating to the Democrats. It could be very devastating to the Democrats.
I've done a lot of this litigation, and have pushed back on a lot, and we've won. We've won every time at the federal district court level. We've had some rebuffing at the 11th Circuit on the rights of those with felony convictions. My analysis showed that in that litigation that there were 750,000 individuals who had been otherwise eligible because they didn't commit a crime of murder or a sex crime, but for their legal fines and obligations. 750,000 is a lot of votes, but they're not necessarily all going to be voting Democratic, and they're certainly not all going to register and turn out. Whether or not there are barriers or other type of barriers of registration and turnout. The fact that the Democratic Party in Florida had about 1 million people who didn't even vote in 2020 is, something that I think a lot of attention should be put on. Again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be focusing on these laws, many of which are discriminatory, and which, I've done my part in terms of exploiting that and showing that. But there are a lot of other factors out there in terms of the mobilization, and whether or not that has to do with the policy issues. Again, James Carville was on Blair NewsHour. My God, I'm old. On the NewsHour, and the other day, and his whole take was, we got to stop with this cancel culture and all this nonsense, in that wonderful Carville-esque way. At the same time, that motivates a lot of younger people. But it's that trade-off then. Is it going to then see what we saw perhaps in Virginia? I'll say, Henry's very close up there in that area, I suspect, still. And one of the interesting questions in terms of policy was the Ethiopian community, which is very large in Virginia, is furious with the Biden administration. I mean, there's effectively a civil war. Well, there's a civil war, and there's going to be an overthrow of the government in any day now in Addis. And I think there was probably some backlash against the Biden administration by many of those in the Ethiopian community. And that's enough to make up that 0.5% difference. No one's talked about that, but having a lot of Ethiopian friends, there's certainly talk about that as, taking credit for the victory.
Professor, you're playing a dangerous game combining my other research focus on African politics here with only a few minutes left. But I think it's a good point, especially in Virginia, with the shifting demographic and that driving, increased population boom in Northern Virginia, but also just the different types of voters that you're now seeing in Virginia that's kind of driven the Democratic shift to unified control up under Northam until last week or this week. It's been a long week. So I think the Ethiopian case is a really descriptive example of what role the Biden administration is going to have to play on issues that are not just bread and butter, but these foreign policy issues. I think we've yet to see the impact of Afghanistan and that whether that sticks as an issue for him. But all these, I saw one question was about kind of the role of President Biden's platform as it relates to the Tea Party. But I think broadly, that's going to be the interesting question. Youngkin did a great job, I think, of shifting away from that and focusing on school boards. Almost 100%. It was school boards while McAuliffe was running the anti-Trump, Trump. I saw some interesting op-ed counting the number of times McAuliffe said Trump versus Youngkin. And so I think that writ large could be a problem for at a lot of states for the Democrats.
Well, thank you. I say we're just about out of time. And unless somebody wants to have the final say, I guess I will have it to say thank you all very much. And I speak for all of those that were listening in. It's been very informative, and certainly for me is making me look at the next couple of years somewhat differently. So thank you all, and
thanks
enjoy
everyone.
the rest of the conference.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.